There are two sayings of the Desert Fathers, the early Christian monks, that highlight John Mayne's place in the tradition that we are engaging with these 2 days, and how he brought that tradition into contact with modern consciousness and that hunger for depth and meaning which marks our contemporary world so strongly and at times so painfully. The first of them is that the theologian is one who prays, and one who prays is a theologian. This gives us, I think, an insight into the original understanding of theology and its relationship to prayer, to deep prayer. When the Desert Fathers spoke of prayer, they spoke of pure prayer, the prayer of the heart, what we call meditation in this sense. And that connection between theology, speaking about God, and praying, being with God, is, I think, essential for our discovery of depth and meaning. Without that, I think we are bifurcated, and that interior division of the Western soul especially is causing us great distress. And the second saying is that the monk who knows that he is praying is not truly praying. The monk who does not know that he is praying is truly praying. So that may be the point where many academics will leave the room. John Mayne's teaching evolved through the gift of faith, transmitted to him by his Irish Catholic family, and also through the great challenges that his own life led him to confront. He was born in London in 1926, educated at Westminster Choir School, and then later by the Jesuits in London. At 6 years old, he went to spend a year at Ballinskelligs in County Kerry, where his family roots lay, and where he felt he had his geographical insertion point into the cosmos, as he once said. And from Ballinskelligs, of course, he could see Skellig Michael, the rugged monastic mountain 7 miles off the coast of Kerry, a monastic settlement from as early perhaps as the 6th century until the late 12th century. I think the last abbot of Skellig was, or responsible for Skellig, was Laurence O'Toole, I think the first Archbishop of Dublin. So it's out that one could make that into a bit more of a hagiographical kind of detail, and he never said to me that he had gone to Skellig, but he would have seen it, and he would have heard about it, and he would have asked about it, and he knew about it. And through that knowledge, there was a link through the monastic tradition to the early Christianity and the early monasticism of Syria and Egypt and Palestine. Christianity is, of course, originally a Middle Eastern religion, and the monastic movement which began there in the 4th, 5th centuries had a very direct and powerful impact, as you know, on the Irish Church. St. Patrick would have absorbed that firsthand at Laurence in the south of France, at Tours, and contributed to the unique nature of the Irish Church as a monastic rather than a diocesan Roman Church. John Mayne was deeply inspired and transformed when he connected with that tradition, which he had studied, of course, much earlier, but when he connected with it later in his adult life, and when it transformed the way he prayed and the way he felt that the church had a gift of inestimable value to share with modern people, religious or non-religious, in their hunger for depth and meaning. John Mayne, according to Rowan Williams, John Mayne effectively put the desert tradition of prayer to work in our day. He put it to work in our day. He was practical about prayer. And this led to the formation of a community. One of his essential ideas, which we are exemplifying today, is that meditation creates community. We could have a whole, in fact we did have a whole seminar recently in London at our Meditatio Centre on that very idea. Rowan Williams, who's a friend of the WCCM, the World Community for Christian Meditation, says in the next sentence, the WCCM is for me, as for many, a taste of what a committed contemplative church might look like. John Main was called up into the army in the last year or two of the war, and he was in the Royal Signal Corps. And he would tell the story of how the work that they were doing to identify enemy signals was transformed by the introduction of the quartz crystal. Inserted into the radio, it gave them a much higher degree of precision in identifying radio signals. And he described this as he used this as a metaphor to describe prayer, and in particular the form of prayer that he had found in John Cassian and the desert tradition. He said by the simple repetition of a prayer phrase, a formula, a mantra, he says this is like a quartz crystal that puts us into touch, puts us on the wavelength of the mind of Christ. There's a little example of how, as with any teacher, life experience affects the way the person teaches and what they discover. Some years ago I was having to confront someone who was accusing John Main of being New Age. And I said, well, that's unusual. I said, as a Trinitarian mystic, how do you think he's New Age? And they said, well, he goes on and on about crystals. So I got them to show me the passage where, the only passage as far as I know, where he mentions crystal, and it's in this sense. After the war, still as a young man, he entered the Canons Regular of the Lateran, studied in Rome for a year, but then left the order and took refuge in Trinity College Dublin, where he studied law. After graduation, he joined, not for any ideological reasons, but I suppose to see the world, he joined the British Colonial Service. He studied Chinese at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and was sent out to Malaya, as it then was, which was in a state of insurgency, and was appointed to the office of the Governor General, still continuing to learn Chinese, but at the service of the Governor General's office. And one day, he was sent to visit an Indian monk on the outskirts of Kuala Lumpur to thank this monk who had been appointed a Justice of the Peace by the British for his work in bringing about reconciliation among the warring groups, and also who had set up a center and an orphanage for children who of different religions, who were brought up in their own religion of that insurgency. So John Main's job was simply to go and thank him and compliment him and invite him to have tea with the Queen one day. But as the encounter unfolded, he realized that he was in the presence of a very deep and holy man, and that this man's work and compassionate action flowed out of a deep interiority. And so, as John Main himself was a deeply religious man, the conversation turned to the spiritual life and to prayer. And the monk asked him, "Do you pray, Mr. Main?" And he said, "Yes, I prayed." And he described how he prayed, as most Christians would pray at that time and today. And the monk listened respectfully and said, "It's wonderful to meet a man of the world who is also a spiritual man." And then they began to speak about the monk's way of prayer, and he described what he called meditation as a way of silence. And he described it in this way. He said, "We believe that the Spirit of God, who creates the universe, dwells within the human heart, and in silence is loving to all." These words from one of the Upanishads struck John Main very deeply. And of course, it awakened many associations in his own Christian faith of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit and the love that floods the inmost heart through the Holy Spirit God has given us, as St. Paul describes it. And they talked more about meditation, and John Main then asked him, could you help me to meditate, to pray in this way? And the monk said, well, of course, anyone can meditate. He said, it will make you a better Christian. So he said, but I can only teach you if you're serious about it. He was a busy man. And John Main said, well, what does serious mean? How much do I have to pay? And the monk said, all I ask is that you meditate every day, morning and evening. And if you like, then you can come back to me once a week and we can meditate together. And if you have any questions, we can discuss them. And John Main, who was a very disciplined person, his legal studies had probably helped him with that, but he was a very organized and disciplined individual, integrated those times of meditation into his daily life and his other forms of Christian prayer. And he would return once a week to meditate with his teacher. And the way he was meditating was essentially the way that he taught in the later part of his life, and that has formed our community over the years. It is to take a single word or a short phrase, to stay with the same word. That's a significant step, to stay with the same word. If you know the hesychast tradition of the Eastern Church, then you'll recognize this. And to repeat this word continually, faithfully, during the whole time of the meditation, and to keep returning to the word. So this was a practice of radical simplicity, which he engaged with his characteristic discipline and enthusiasm. About 2 years or so later, he returned to Ireland, came back to Trinity, and eventually held, I think, the Reed Chair of Criminal Law. Is it? It's not your... Reed Professor, not yours, is it? No, sorry. It was the chair that Mary McAleese held as well, I think. And Mary Robinson. Oh, he didn't become president of Ireland, though. So, and he loved his life here. He loved Dublin. He said he did all his work very early in the morning and took the rest of the day off. So he didn't have as many meetings as you do. Anyway, but during this time, he was also close to his family. He suffered the death of a nephew of his, a young boy, which added to his failure to marry the woman he wanted to marry. His old religious vocation awoke, maybe it had never left him, and he surprised his friends, family, and colleagues by becoming a monk, and especially by becoming a monk in England, at Ealing Abbey in London. His novice master said he would only stay 6 weeks. His novice master was a very good man, I knew him later in life, also told him to stop meditating. When he had a discussion with him about his prayer life, and he heard about the origin of this practice, he said, well, it doesn't seem to me very Catholic, so I think you should give up and we'll start again. So in those days, monks were obedient. And he obeyed, although he says later in a little autobiographical work called the Gethsemane Talks, his first public talk really on meditation to the monks of Gethsemane, Merton's monastery in America, he said it was the beginning of a spiritual desert. But of course he was continuing to be enriched and enlarged by his monastic life, which he loved, and by his studies in Rome during the Second Vatican Council, and his general monastic prayer life. He returned to London, where he taught in the school, St. Benedict School. That's where I first met him. as a young boy in 1958. And then in the late 60s, he was sent to Washington, to our monastery there, and to take over a school that was in a crisis. And while he was there, a young American student came to see him who had just been around all the ashrams and meditation centers of Asia, and had come back home and was now wondering whether there was anything in Christianity that could compare with what he had learned in the Orient. And John Main was asked to look after this guy, and he put him onto a track of studying the Desert Fathers, and in particular John Cassian, the great monk of the desert who brought the wisdom of the desert to the West. And it was there in the 10th conference of Cassian that John Main recognized at a crucial moment in his own life the same essential practice of meditation, of this prayer of the heart that he had been introduced to from the universal tradition many years before. Because he recognized it and it triggered the right place in him at that time, he began to meditate again and was led very deeply in a very short time. He came back, 5 years later, he came back to London convinced that this was his work and set up at his monastery there a small meditation center, and then was later invited by the Archbishop of Montreal to establish a center, a monastery and a center there dedicated to the teaching and to the practice of Christian meditation. He died there in Montreal in 1982 at the age of 56. And I think many people felt this was tragically early, and that the work that he had begun, which had already begun to spread around the world, that this was now going to be cut short. In fact, and so I wasn't sure whether that wasn't going to happen too. But very soon after he died, I could see that his legacy and that what he had discovered and what he was transmitting, what we're all about here these 2 days is tradition. Not tradition as a library thing only, but tradition as a personally transmitted consciousness. And that he had already begun this transmission, and it was now being carried on by men and women in all walks of life, not just monks, around the world. Raymond Panica, the great student of religion, said that John Main had the genius of simplicity. And Adalbert de Vogüé, the great Benedictine scholar, said that he gave to Latin monasticism, or reminded Latin monasticism, of something that it had not produced, an actual method of contemplative prayer that, of course, was well known and practiced in the Orthodox and the Eastern Church. So tomorrow we'll talk a little bit more about the legacy and the thought of John Main. But what I'd like to do now is take my last actually I don't, I have 10 minutes. I'm going to take my last 5 minutes to just introduce you and to begin our time together with a short period of silence and of meditation. Well, I can see the meditators among you are already responding like Pavlovian subjects. Wonderful thing about meditation and its radical simplicity is that it doesn't matter whether you've been meditating for 40 years or you've never meditated before. You are always a beginner. That's why it is so refreshing. Meditation is the prayer of the heart, and the heart in the mystical tradition refers not just to a physical organ, not just to an abstract concept, but to the whole person, the human being in our wholeness of body, mind, and spirit. So maybe we can just take a moment to pay attention to that physical dimension, first of all, by the way we sit. The body is a sacrament of the whole person, so the way we sit will affect the way we are mentally, So just sit with your back straight, your feet on the ground. You can put your hands on your lap or on your knees so that your physical posture is relaxed and alert. Relax your shoulders, relax the muscles of your face. You can close your eyes lightly if you like. And for a few moments, just be aware of your breath. In all traditions, the breath is very integral to our spiritual life. St. Anthony of the Desert called the monks together once and said, "Always breathe Christ." So just be aware of your breath. As you breathe in the gift of life. And because it is gift, we also breathe out, we let go. So every breath we take is a kind of prayer. John Main said in meditation, we accept the gift of our being. And now we begin that simple practice that John Main found in his own early monastic tradition, which we practice, to take us deeper and to lay aside our thoughts. The third Desert Father saying that influenced him greatly. Prayer is the laying aside of thoughts. So to do that, we take a word. It's natural to take a word that is sacred in your own tradition. It's helpful if it's not in your own language, because then it doesn't stimulate thought and imagination. You could take the name Jesus, or the word Abba. The word we recommend, and John Main recommended, is the word Maranatha, an ancient Christian prayer, Aramaic in the language that Jesus spoke. It means, "Come, Lord," but we're not thinking about the meaning of the word as we say it. We're laying aside even good thoughts at the time of meditation. And if you choose this word, say it as 4 syllables, Ma-ra-na-tha. Ma-ra-na-tha. Articulate the word clearly in your mind and heart. Listen to the word as you say it. Give it your full attention. Say it gently without force or impatience. Say it attentively and faithfully. So when the mind wanders, which of course it will, regularly, as soon as you realize that you've stopped saying the word, simply drop the thought, unfinished, drop the problem solving, drop the fantasy, and return to your word. The word again I would offer is Maranatha. Ma-ra-na-tha.